Hey everybody, before we begin, let's start with a small quiz. Do you recognize this sound? I think many of us will do. It's of course the theme to any kind of Netflix TV show or movie. I have another one. What about this one? Don't worry, the audio isn't broken. You've heard nothing, because that is the same thing I heard when I tried to play some Netflix content I downloaded onto my device recently while I was abroad. When I tried to play it at home, instead I saw this message. This title is not available to watch in your area. You will be unable to play the title until you connect to the internet in a country where it is available. In many cases, this will be the country you were in when you downloaded it. Well, no problem. I can just set up a VPN connection to one of my servers in a different country and then resume watching, right? Well, that is when I got greeted with yet another message. You seem to be using a VPN or proxy. To fix the problem, try turning off your VPN. That's weird. I specifically remember seeing many different ads for VPN providers promising me to unblock any content from anywhere in the world. After taking a trial subscription for one of these providers and seeing that it indeed works as intended, I was wondering, what differs between their VPN server and mine I just set up? How can these commercial VPN providers do geo-unblocking? We will look into this in this talk. This is Stranger VPNs. My name is Etienne Kahn, and I'll be presenting this. My co-authors are Anas Birotto, Jeroen van der Ham, and Roland van Rijswijk-Dij. Alright, let's see what this investigation into the geo-unblocking capabilities of commercial VPN providers uncovers. As I mentioned at the beginning, I had a trial account to one of those VPN providers. So one of the first things I tried was just a simple trace route. But this is where we struck gold immediately. As you can see on the screen, we only had one hop to 192.0.0.69. Those of you who recognize this /24 will also know that this is reserved for IETF protocol assignments. So what's going on there? By the way, the DNS server we used to do this request is from the VPN provider themselves. I tried some other flags as well for traceroute, like TCP and whatnot, but it didn't work. I always ended at this IP address. Yet, when I went to netflix.com in the browser, everything went fine, and I was able to stream. I checked out the TLS certificates, and they're fine as well. This seems to be a dead end. Well, it turns out that Netflix's CDN has a secret which we can uncover. On the screen here, we see the URL to one of their CDNs, and this specific one we just got by checking out the traffic we could see while streaming content from Netflix. With curl, we just get the headers because we don't need the content of the CDN directly. Let's run it. So we get some headers, and most of the response is not really relevant. Let me highlight the interesting parts. As we can see here, there's an adder space in x-tcp-info, and it contains the IP address of the host we used to do this query. So at the university workstations, it was a university IP. From my mobile phone, it was my mobile carrier's IP address. And of course, when we do this with the VPN provider connected, well, we assume we get the VPN's IP address, right? Well, this is where we're all wrong. So now the question is, does it happen systematically that the IP address of the VPN server does not match with the IP address we get back from the CDN? To test that, we bought multiple more subscriptions to VPN providers, which we can see here on the left side of this image. There were some requirements for those providers though. They should appear in popular review sites, they should have, of course, geo-unblocking capabilities, and they should be somewhat representative of different market shares. So we can see very big providers like EXPRESSVPN and NordVPN, but also some smaller ones like VPN or CYBERGHOST. Also, the geo-unblocking regions we tested were not entirely chosen at random. The United States is very famous for its content, so that one was, of course, a must-have in the list. Also, Japan has some niche content like anime, which might also be interesting for geo-unblocking purposes. Finally, we have Germany and the Netherlands for geographical diversity. We only have 4 regions in the geo-unblocking because most VPN providers have a connection limit to prohibit account sharing. That's why we concentrated on the most common factor of all VPN providers, that was at least 4 connections. Our data collection boils down to basically requesting the IP header every 30 seconds through all these previously mentioned regions for each VPN provider. And for that, we have 2 measurement campaigns. One from the 24th of February 2022 to the 15th of May 2022 with roughly 4 million samples. The second one from the 1st of July 2022 to the 29th of October 2022 with roughly 7 million samples. By the way, a raw sample looks like this. We have a Unix timestamp, a status, and the IP address we extracted from the header. The status is important because sometimes connections just time out, and we wanted to save that in our log if we have one of these timeouts. So, what can we say so far? So far, the inferred Geo-Unblocking system looks like this. We, as a VPN user, connect to the VPN provider gateway. We need to make use of their DNS server. Then we request Netflix.com or any kind of other site we want to geo-unblock. Apparently, there seems to be some kind of TLS proxy that tunnels our connection, and then we get sent through either the cloud on top or those houses at the bottom. What specialized ISP and hosting provider and residential proxy means is what we'll get to next in the results. When we look at all of our results combined in one big table, we get this. Don't worry, I'll explain what this means in the next part. Okay, let's have a closer look at the very first row on top, CyberGhost. Remember, CyberGhost doesn't do unblocking in the Netherlands. That's why there's an empty space. What we can see are 3 graphs, each containing 2 subgraphs. Let's have a look at the first row of subgraphs, the top ones. The top graphs show the unique IP addresses we recorded per day. In green, we see IPv4 addresses, and in pink, we see IPv6 addresses. Right now, there's not much pink to see, but we'll get to that later. The black line shows IP churn, or fresh IPs per day. At the very first day of measurement, all IPs are fresh, which is why the black graph starts high. If most encountered IPs are fresh, the downwards trend will be slow, as we can see to the right in the United States. Now let's have a look at the bottom graphs. The bottom graphs show how often the corresponding ASN to the earlier mentioned IP addresses have been seen. In total, we recorded 2,059 unique ASNs, and we gave the top 50 of those ASNs a unique color. This color is coherent throughout the whole image. Due to visual fidelity, we could not give any other ASNs a unique color. That's why all other ASNs outside of the top 50 have received the color black. We can see some of those again on the right side in the United States. Now that we understand this image, we can take a look at some interesting patterns. For example, to the left in Germany, there are many different ASNs used, as we can see in those colorful bottom graphs. And the amount of IP addresses that enter the unblocking system seem to be somewhat at the same pace as IPs are leaving, because the black churn graph is always halfway, roughly, between the peaks of the green IP spikes. In the somewhat middle, we see Japan using very many ASNs in the first few days of our measurement, but then it tapered off very quickly, and they seem to be only using a single ASN for their unblocking in Japan. And also we can see the amount of IP addresses used instantly falls to a way lower rate than in the first few days. We can observe something similar in the United States to the very right. At some point in July, they switched from using only a few ASNs to very many different ASNs for their unblocking. And also we can see that the number of IP addresses used varies greatly. To the very right in the United States, we can see that CyberGhost seems to be using roughly 2,400 unique IPv4s per day, whereas in Germany, they seem to be content with only using roughly 40 to 60 IPv4s per day. Let's quickly look at some other results. In this case, EXPRESSVPN. We can see many different patterns here as well. For example, in the very right, United States, we see the pink graph on top, which means IPv6, whereas in other regions, for example, Germany, it's IPv4 only. In the middle, Japan and Netherlands seem to be a mixture of IPv4 and IPv6, as we can see by these small pink spikes in between those greener, larger spikes in Japan, for example. Also interesting to note is that in Japan, EXPRESSVPN seems to be using the orange ASN for quite a long time. Then they switched to many different ASNs, and at some point they switched back to the orange one. Similar in the Netherlands, the orange one is being used at the beginning together with the yellow one. Then they switched to many different ASNs until they settled on only using the orange one again. A bit of a different picture is Surfshark, which in many regions uses this orange ASN, and they seem to be also using IPv6 exclusively, as we can see by the top graph. And also, the black IP churn line follows the top perfectly, meaning every IP we have recorded was a fresh IPv6 address. Interesting to note, though, is in the United States, where they seem to be using a different kind of pattern. And also, we can see these small stripes roughly in August, where for some reason there were a few days where they've been using many different ASNs to unblock, and then they switched back to their mixture of green and orange ASNs. Lastly, we have PRIVATEVPN, who seem to be only making use of 2 different ASNs for all the unblocking regions. And we can also see that their IP addresses are only 1, 2, or at most, well, I guess 4 IPs at one point in time. This is also different to the providers we've seen earlier, which use sometimes even thousands or 2,400 different IPs per day. What this all means, we'll check out in the next section. Let me remind you of the inferred Geo-Unblocking system. We've collected many IP addresses, roughly 215,000 unique IPv4s and roughly 2 million unique IPv6 addresses. We can now deduce their origins. Let's start with the specialized ISPs and hosting providers. Hosting providers are not that interesting because they're usually small local providers, nothing like AWS, OVH, or similar. But getting to the specialized ISPs. For example, we can take a look at the maintainer objects of the IP addresses of the IPs we saw at PRIVATEVPN. We could look up all their business information in the Swedish companies registry, and we found out that the same people who run PRIVATEVPN were actually running the other companies who were listed as maintainers for the IP addresses we can see here on the screenshot. For example, we have Nordic Internet Services AB, which is a fake ISP PRIVATEVPN has set up. Or we have PV DataNet, which is also a fake hosting provider which belongs to PRIVATEVPN. Another interesting company is TrafficForce. On the internet website, they only say that they provide unique solutions for global networks, but what exactly that means, nobody knows, except that many of the VPN providers seem to be using their IP addresses for geo-unblocking purposes. Finally, we can move to the last section, residential proxies. Here's a small overview of ASNs we discovered in our dataset. We took the top 2 for every country. You see some big names in there like Deutsche Telekom, KPN, or Comcast. We actually contacted some of these ISPs and asked them if those are really IP addresses from residential assignments or if it could be something else like hosting from these providers. And they indeed confirmed that those were residential. We also have seen some other ASNs, rather interesting ASNs, I would say, pop up. For example, we've seen the ASN of the Dutch Ministry of Defense, who we of course immediately contacted after finding them in our dataset to report on the suspicious activity we encountered. In conclusion, what have we seen today? We've seen that the commercial geo-unblocking works like this. A user connects to a VPN provider gateway and requests a site like Netflix or any other streaming site. There, the IP returned is actually not the real IP to the site, but to a TLS proxy. The TLS proxy does not let us map the unblocking IPs in a traditional manner. Instead, we can only rely on using the Netflix header to very slowly extract the used IPs. From the TLS proxy, the traffic either tunnels through the specialized ISPs and hosting providers or through the residential networks before we arrive at our streaming site. But why do all of this? We strongly believe that streaming providers like Netflix make use of third parties to supply them with metadata on the IPs that connect to them. In the paper, we call those providers enhanced geolocation providers because they contain additional information such as residential IP, yes, no, or unknown. This also answers my initial question, why my own VPN won't unblock, but a commercial one will. They are not using off-the-shelf hosting like I do, but have access to IPs from ASNs which lie in blind spots of enhanced geolocation providers.